Hi viewers, welcome to GRS Learn Life Sciences. In our previous video, we have discussed about the respiratory system of birds. So in that video, we have discussed the anatomy of the respiratory tract and also the lungs and air sacs. In this video, we are going to learn how the gaseous exchange takes place in lungs. So we must remember that the gaseous exchange cannot take place in the air sacs. So it takes place only inside of the lungs. So in our earlier video we have discussed the anatomy of the respiratory tract. In that video we have seen so many anatomical parts of the respiratory tract, like external nostrils, then nasal sacs, then internal nostrils, then internal nostrils opens into pharynx, the pharynx opens into the trachea through the glottis. Glottis is a slit like aperture which opens into the respiratory trachea. Then the anterior part of respiratory trachea gets expands and forms the structure that is called larynx. And the larynx doesn't produce a sound in the birds. It is a degenerative structure, so it cannot produce sound. But in amphibians and in other vertebrate classes, they produce sound. Also, the posterior part of trachea expands and forms the other characteristic feature of the bird, that is called the syrinx. So this syrinx is also known as the voice box, which produces the sound as it has the tympanic membranes on the walls of this syrinx. This respiratory trachea produces two branches. They are called bronchus, and these bronchus they enter into the lungs and becomes the primary bronchus. So primary bronchus doesn't have the cartilaginous rings inside of it, but this bronchus and trachea, they have cartilaginous rings and ossified rings. In bronchus region we observe the incomplete rings. In trachea region we observe the complete rings. So those ossified rings and cartilaginous rings, they provide internal support for this trachea pipe. Then this primary bronchus towards the posterior part of the lung becomes to the mesobronchus. The primary bronchi towards the posterior part of the lung is called mesobronchi. And from this mesobronchi or primary bronchi, we see the formation of the secondary bronchi. So the primary bronchi gives off the secondary bronchi, and the secondary bronchi further divides to form the tertiary bronchi. Then the tertiary bronchi is also known as the parabronchi. This tertiary bronchi further forms some small capillary structure, and those capillaries are called air capillaries. So in those air capillaries we observe the gases exchange. So the site of the gases exchange is parabronchi, or we say the air capillaries. So these all structures are present inside of the lung, so we don't observe any gases exchange inside of this air sacs. So these air sacs towards the posterior part or abdominal part, they develop from the just the mesobronchus, but the anterior air sacs they develop from the secondary bronchus. So the dilation of the mesobronchus are called the posterior air sacs, and the dilation of this secondary bronchus are called the anterior air sacs. So dilations from the secondary bronchus are called anterior air sacs. So the dilations from the mesobronchus are called the posterior air sacs. So posterior air sacs directly develops from the mesobronchus, but not the anterior air sacs. They don't develop from directly the primary bronchus. So the primary bronchus forms the secondary bronchus inside of the lung, and thus dilations of the secondary bronchus are called the air sacs. Now let us see how the respiration takes place inside of the bird. This mechanism takes place in two steps. One is called inspiration and the second process is called expiration. During the inspiration, through the external nostrils, air enters into the nasal sacs. From the nasal sacs it reaches to the pharynx by the internal nostrils. Then from the pharynx it enters into the trachea pipe through the glottis. Then trachea pipe it reaches to the bronchus region. From the bronchus the air reaches into the lungs. So inside of the lung, the air moves in the primary bronchus, then into the mesobronchus directly, then it reaches to the posterior air sacs. Also from this mesobronchus, some of the air reaches into the secondary bronchus. From the secondary bronchus they reaches to the tertiary bronchus, and from tertiary bronchus they reaches to the air capillaries. So this inspiration process is an active process like other vertebrates. The expiration process is not an active process. The mechanism of inspiration takes place in two ways in birds, and this inspiration is controlled by the sternum and two types of muscles in the birds. They are called abdominal muscles and intercostal muscles. So due to the action of intercostal muscles and abdominal muscles, this bird during the rest time it continuously rises and lowers. So So due to the action of these intercostal muscles and abdominal muscles in birds, this sternum it continuously rises and lowers. So when it lowers, the air sacs gets they expand, not the lung. So the lung gets compressed, but the air sacs they gets expand. When the air sacs they gets expand inside of the lungs, the air pressure gets decreased. So when the air pressure gets decreased, the air from the external nostrils enters into the lungs. Then the air directly reaches into the posterior abdominal sac. Also some of the air reaches into the secondary bronchi. From secondary bronchi then it reaches to the parabronchi and then air capillaries. So this is how the inspiration takes place during the rest time. But during the flight, there is no change in the sternum, so it is completely immovable structure. So we don't see any change in the sternum. So then we see the change in the body. So backside, so the backside it rises and lowers due to the action of the wings. So due to the strokes of these wings, the back part of the body rises and lowers. When the back part of body rises and lowers, then we see the expansion of these air sacs and compression of these lungs. And due to this, again we see the decrease in the air pressure in the lungs. Then the air from external nostrils enters into the lungs. So the inspiration process in flying birds is completely depends on the how fast they fly. So the birds which fly so fast, they take more oxygen than the birds which fly very slow. So this is how inspiration process takes place. Then let us see how the expiration process takes place. So during inspiration the sternum lowers, and during expiration process the sternum rises. When the sternum rises, the lungs gets expand. At the same time the air sacs gets compressed. So earlier, that means during the inspiration process, the lungs they gets compressed and the air sacs they gets expanded. But now it is completely opposite. The air sacs gets compressed and the lungs they gets expanded. In this process the air from this air sacs reaches into the secondary bronchi through this recurrent bronchi or the sacobronchi. So we know that the air sacs in turn they are connected to the lungs by the sacobronchi or the recurrent bronchi. So then the air from these air sacs reaches to the secondary bronchi through this sacobronchi or recurrent bronchi. Then air from this secondary bronchi, then the tertiary bronchi and air capillaries, it moves towards the anterior sacs. So now anterior sacs are filled by the deoxygenated air. So after the gases exchange, the deoxygenated gas reaches to the anterior bronchi. In inspiration process, the air from trachea reaches to the bronchus. From bronchus, it reaches to the primary bronchi of the lungs. Then from primary bronchi of lung, it reaches to the mesobronchus, and then from mesobronchus, it reaches to the posterior air sacs, and also some of the air reaches to the secondary bronchus. Then secondary bronchus, it reaches to the tertiary bronchus or parabronchi. From parabronchi, it reaches to the air capillaries. So in this inspiration process, in parabronchi, we observe the exchange of gases. So we observe the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So in the first cycle of inspiration, we observe the exchange of gases. Then this inspiration is followed by expiration process. In expiration process, these air sacs they gets compressed. So during the inspiration process, the air sacs they gets expand. Due to the expansion of these air sacs, the air pressure decreases in air sacs, and air enters from atmosphere into the respiratory tract expand. But during inspiration process they get compressed. At the same time the lungs gets expand during the inspiration. So when the lungs get expand and the air sacs get compressed, so the air from these air sacs now reaches into the secondary bronchi and then into the parabronchi. When it reaches to the parabronchi, we observe the exchange of gases. So in inspiration and as well as in the expiration, we observe exchange of gases. So the CO2 and oxygen exchange can be takes place in both inspiration process and expiration process. In inspiration process, some of the air reaches to the secondary bronchi, so that air involves in the exchange of gases. Also during the expiration process, the air from posterior air sacs reaches to the parabronchi again. So this air is having high amount of oxygen, so we again observe the exchange of gases. Then second cycle of inspiration begins. In second cycle of inspiration, we again observe the expansion of these air sacs. So when the air sacs are expanded, that means when the anterior sac is expanded, we observe the decrease of pressure in the anterior air sacs. Due to the decrease of air pressure in the anterior air sac, now air from this parabronchi reaches to the anterior sac. Also, the air from outside atmosphere reaches to the posterior air sacs as the pressure is decreased in the posterior air sacs due to the expansion. Then in second cycle of expiration, again we observe the compression of these air sacs and expansion of these lungs. Due to the compression of air sacs, now the air from the post air sac reaches to the again into this parabronchus through the recurrent bronchi. Also from this anterior air sac, the air reaches into the secondary bronchus, then into the primary bronchus, then into the bronchus through the recurrent bronchi. So through the recurrent bronchi, from the anterior air sac, the air moves into the bronchus, and from the bronchus it reaches to the trachea. While air moves in this junction, the junction has the syrinx, and that syrinx produces sound. So from the trachea, then the air reaches to the pharynx. From the pharynx, the air is expelled outside of the body by the internal nares, nasal sacs, and external nostrils. So the anterior air sacs are filled by air in the second cycle of inspiration, and the air from the anterior air sacs is expelled in the second cycle of expiration. So in first cycle of inspiration, the posterior air sacs are filled by air, and in the first cycle of expiration, the air from posterior air sacs is expelled into the parabronchi. So this is how the respiration mechanism takes place in the birds. So this process is completed by two steps. They are called inspiration process and expiration process. Again, during the flight and during the rest period of the bird, we observe this inspiration process and expiration process are different. During inspiration process of birds which are flying, they don't depend on the movement of the sternum, but the birds which are resting, they depend on the movement of the sternum. So thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe for my channel.